and welcome to a new session of Thriving Thursdays. That, as you know, is our monthly series of talks with inspiring diversity and inclusion experts who share their insights, their tools, and best practices. Today, we have with us Sathya Bala, who will talk about using data and storytelling to unlock inclusion. On a personal note, I'm very happy that Sathya is joining us today. Not only because I think the topic is extremely relevant for our roles as the EI champions, but also because I had the opportunity to meet Sathya in a panel in February this year. It was a panel with Ceremount, where we were both speakers, and she was really inspiring. Then I had the pleasure of meeting her in person in London and in New York, and since then I have always wanted for you to meet her as well. Sathya is an amazing speaker, and she has very strong experience and knowledge about data, and we are sure that we will learn a lot during this session. But before starting, as we usually do, I want to share with you some key information. So first, please note that the session is going to be recorded and uploaded, as we always do, to the Diversity and Inclusion Champions platform under the section named Resources. Also, we encourage you to turn on your cameras. I see that many of you have done it already, and so I thank you for that. Seeing your face makes a big difference in having an active participation. In that sense, please note that although the session is being recorded and posted, only the slides and the speaker will be visible in the video, because once the video is posted on the platform, the faces of the audience will not be shown. Also, and very important, there is a translation function available for you all. We are going to share in the chat now the instructions to access this translation feature. If you have any questions, and I hope you are going to be very curious and are going to ask many questions, we invite you to keep them and ask them at the end of the presentation. This way, we let Sathya to complete her presentation, and at the end, she will address any questions posted in the chat or ask directly to her when she finishes. And last but not least, at the end of the session, after the Q&A, we'll share with you a survey that we would greatly appreciate if you could respond to it. You will have some minutes to do it, but your feedback is always very important. I think this is all from my side. Without further ado, I'm passing the mic to Sathya. Sathya, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much, Nacho, and I'm very glad to be here with all of you. I'm dialing in from London. You know, with these virtual conversations, we're dialing in from so many different places. And so that I know you are with me and engaged on a topic that I'm very passionate about, data and storytelling, I will be inviting you throughout this session to contribute in the chat. And for those who feel like it, to raise their hand and answer some questions directly. So this is going to be a pretty practical and interactive session. And so I'm hoping at certain points the chat is going to pop off and I can't even keep track of what's going on. You know, that because we're not all in the same room, that's how we can really get a sense of each other and me know that I'm not putting you all to sleep, which is also nice for my validation. So before I get into everything that we're going to be talking about, this session, as was introduced, is about using data and storytelling to unlock inclusion. Now, this is a huge topic, so I'm really just going to give you a taster of certain topics and hopefully start getting you thinking of how you can use each other as a champion network to keep sharing learnings and examples, and maybe those challenges where we want to use data to drive change, but people are a little bit scared or lacking in confidence. I'm trying to equip you with some like foundational things to start to advance how you think about data, feel like you're a bit more empowered, and maybe start becoming that person that spreads that knowledge with the people around you. So yeah, this is just the tip of the iceberg, but we are definitely going to get into some interesting concepts. But first of all, why am I here and why am I talking to you? A little bit of context. So there's a picture on the slide of the world, and I feel like I'm very much this kind of traveling citizen, multi-generational immigrant story in terms of my personal story. So I'm Sri Lankan Tamil. I was born in Singapore. My parents were a young married couple that lived in Singapore for like 8, 9 years and loved it. And then when I was quite young, we moved to Sydney, Australia, which is where I grew up and did my schooling and started working in audit and risk at Deloitte. I moved over to London and that's where as a young adult, and that's where I think just before that, I got a taster of living and working overseas. I was in Chicago for 3 months with Deloitte, came to London and then decided to jump into banking and then go into retail grocery supermarket business called Sainsbury's. And that's where I fell into data and data governance. And that has been a core part of my career and how I think and how I drive change for a long time. And then I went back into a few banks to really hone my skills on data, because actually, as we know, you're in a retail environment. Each business is super different. I know even within Inditex, each brand and organization has a slight different approach, and how we tackle data is also very dependent on kind of a culture and an organization and an industry. So I had a bit of an exploration in banking, and then I kind of made it in my career where I got to work for, I guess, quite a beloved brand, Chanel, as the global head of data. But when I was there, that kind of aligned with a point in my journey where I was really passionate about people and inclusion as well. So like you, I put my hand up in my interview at Chanel and I said, I want to be a champion for inclusion, just like yourselves. So I was the global head of data, but I also had this role. And because I was pretty senior, I got to insert myself in a lot of things. And this is when this topic really came together for me in my career and my life. I was like, actually, my data skills and my data knowledge and confidence, and I'm not a techie data person. If I can do it, you can do it. I realized it was so essential in driving change with diversity, equity, inclusion, which is what led me to do a few things. I was really passionate about bringing people together. So I started a community called My Skin, My Story for women of color to share stories and lived experience, because we know that's really important. And then I kind of realized after a while at Chanel, this is my passion. I took the risk and launched my business, True Change, which is about what we're going to talk about. How do we use data and storytelling to drive change? Kind of the head and the heart. And what does it mean when we talk about data storytelling as a skill set? And I also do a bit of work with charities as well. So that's kind of what I'm bringing to you in terms of context. But I like to spend a bit of time on that so you know kind of who I am, since we're going to spend some time together. So I want you to just think. I'm going to ask you 2 questions that are just for yourself. You don't need to share your answer. And please answer like the first thing that comes to your mind. So between 1 and 5, how important do you think data is to diversity, equity, inclusion? So 1 is the least important, 5 is the most important. I want you to hold that in your mind, and then think about, for the part of the business that you're the DEI champion for, where you're trying to drive change, would they answer in a different way? Yeah. Do they potentially feel it's as important as you do? If not, this is where I want you to take some of the things we're talking about and how can we not just be champions for DEI, but champions for how data can really unlock it. Now, we might think it's super important, but now I want you to ask yourself between 1 and 5, how confident are you in dealing with diversity, equity, inclusion data? You know, is it something that where you feel kind of like, oh, I don't know enough and I know it's important, but oh, it freaks me out a little bit. I feel a bit overwhelmed. Is it something that's familiar to you? Again, between 1 and 5. And I think with this question, there's far more variation. And in this conversation, we're just trying to push you up that like confidence curve. One myth I like to bust is to work with data and drive change with data, you do not need to be a data expert. It is purely about feeling more confident about data. So that's hopefully what we're going to be doing together today. Now, some of what I'm going to share today, you might say, I already know this stuff, but I want you to take notes where you think actually some of this information might be helpful in your conversations with stakeholders who are maybe not as supportive or on board with diversity, equity, inclusion, or have like maybe less of an understanding of how data fits in. So why is data vital to diversity, equity, inclusion? I think it's really important to kind of break this down, because I think we all understand that diversity, equity, inclusion isn't just a warm and fuzzy people thing that is the right thing to do, but it is also a business imperative. And we all know that business change only happens when it's underpinned by a few things. I'll start with the bold letters and then I'll read this out. We know, like from even our day jobs, things only happen when there's accountability, there's clarity, it's clear what we're aiming for in terms of success, that there's credibility so people believe in the thing we're trying to change, and we're transparent about it. And that's what data does. Data helps us be accountable, have clarity of direction, know what success looks like, and demonstrate that credible progress and be transparent with where we are in that DEI journey. Because we know with this type of work, it's not just about talking about the good stuff. We have to be honest about the issues too. Now, please share in the chat if you've ever seen this image before, or a version of this image. I'm really curious, because I do think this did the rounds for a period of time. What I love about this image is this is actually the explanation of why data is important in terms of equality versus equity. Why do I say that? Well, without data and insight, we can only create the same interventions, the same activities, the same improvements for everyone. And that's equality, not equity. So that image on the left, because we don't have the insight to tweak what we're doing depending on the group. If we're just aiming for equality, data is not that important. If we're aiming for equity, data is critical, because with data, we can actually identify the specific barriers that certain groups face. So in this image on the left-hand side, it's figuring out which fences are in front of which people and what are the various people's starting points, right? We can see these three people are at kind of different levels on the left-hand side, but how would we know that without data? How would we know that people who are experiencing those various barriers and where they're starting off? And then data helps us tailor, what are the activities, the programs, the interventions? So in the image on the right, the boxes and the ramps to apply to which group. We only know all of that with data. So actually, if we're driving equity, if we're trying to tailor things to where the problems are, that always means that we need data to help us. Okay, so this is the first question to you in the chat, and I know we've warmed up a bit. There's a few things that have come through the chat. With this session, there are no wrong answers. So I want to be really clear, this is a safe space where we're learning, and this is the entire point of sessions like this with the community you have. So please, off the top of your head, please share in the chat what you think some of the benefits are of collecting and using DEI data. I'll let you have a think, but how do you think it helps us, and maybe you personally in your role as a champion? Take your time. And I'll start reading some of these things. And please keep sharing. Yep, showcasing progress. Definitely showing where we are now and where we want to be. To be more transparent than assumed perceptions, give us a GPS of where we are. Yep, check reality. I like that. And plan a strategy, plan the right action, be more transparent strategy, work with information from the data to be really clear on the actions. Data will help us. Yeah, so it's really informing us. Talking about impact. Yeah, data makes things more visible. It lends DEI and related actions more credibility. Yes, perfect. You're taking all my answers, which is what I want to see. We're not relying on feeling. We're giving ourselves some proof. Understanding the needs and therefore the direction. 100%. So you already are clear on those benefits, but what's really interesting is different benefits are going to convince different people. So I think what's really great is you've already crowdsourced a few of those reasons. It's great for us to know, but these are also things that we can articulate when we're trying to encourage people to share their data, or we have some leaders around us who are a little bit nervous of, once we have the data, what if it's scary or it tells us things we don't want to know? So I'm going to summarize some of this, but you've covered it. But it's good to have these in our back pocket, like on the top of our minds. So benefits of DEI data. It is something that really highlights, quantifies, and tracks the challenges with substance, not gut feel. So taking the emotion out of issues, because I think we know this topic can be quite emotional. It can also be great to test a hypothesis or debunk a belief. I've worked with a client where there was a feeling that within their finance department, when they were looking to hire new talent, there was a feeling that women in a certain market just weren't applying when they were trying to improve the gender equity within that department. Now, when they started tracking data through the life cycle of the hiring process, they debunked that myth that the leaders had. Because in some ways, if you think like that, the issue is more on like how we frame the job applications, how we market a new vacancy, which is a bit easier to do than say, oh, it's a problem with how we're screening applicants. But actually, when we saw the data, we realized in that client that actually for that department, the issue was women were applying, but that first phase of internal screening of applications, a whole big chunk of those women were being rejected through that. So there was actually bias more in how we were internally reviewing the applications once they came in, not whether those applicants were applying. That was really powerful. It led to a piece of work which was around those hiring managers and the HR people who do the first two stages of screening. That's where the biggest dropout was. So that can be super powerful. Shining a light on unknowns. And I think sometimes we have to remember it's not just the unknown issues, but there could be unknown opportunities. And I'll be sharing an example later on that brings that to light. Focus efforts and resources where it's most needed to drive action. I know we wish we lived in a time where businesses were throwing all sorts of resources and effort on all sorts of people, issues and challenges. They're not. So this is really about targeting for the biggest effect. When I was talking to some of the Inditex team, they shared that, there's been some great positive change in your organization around disability inclusion, but that is because there were goals and targets and data tracking to help keep that focus. And we know the things that get measured are the things that get changed. It can be great for supporting a business case for change to get buy-in and investment and secure resource. It makes people realize diversity, equity, inclusion is measurable and tangible, and talks about the impact of actions. That can be really helpful for people who think this is a bit of a warm and fuzzy topic and is a bit intangible. And again, you've talked about all of these things, building trust, confidence, and transparency, because we have data backing up that journey. So thank you for that. Now another question for you. I'm wondering, because you all kind of are in different parts of the organization, you all are probably focusing on slightly different things. I want you to just share in the chat, what are some types of diversity, equity, and inclusion data that you've come across? And I know it's a vague and open question, but please share, what are the types of data or data sets that you have either looked at, or maybe data types and sets that you wish you had? Have a think, because I think it's a broader definition than we realize, and then I'll go into maybe how we can categorize that data. Yep, pay gap. Definitely. Thank you. And I always thank the people who are first off the block on the chat. It gives us all a bit of confidence. So thank you for that. Sociographics, demographics. Yep. Representation of different groups, like race, disability, ethnicity. Yep. Gender gap. And it's growing, yeah, gender divide. So maybe from a workforce standpoint, but it can be even broader than that. You know, sometimes as we mature, we can look at what's that divide with customers or with our suppliers. Gender percentage, promotion opportunities, yes, education, gender, disability, representation. Yep, great. So I think, you know, it's really helpful to think of the scope of DEI data in a few different ways. So you've started talking about a few of them. So first of them is, what's the actual like content of the data? And often we will think first of diversity of people. So this is those demographics and representation. So what are those characteristics like age, gender, or disability? And what is the percentage of people within a population that have that demographic? So when you're dealing with Power BI dashboards, which I've had a glimpse on, a lot of that is around workforce diversity. And that tends to be data that is kind of relatively static, right? So that data doesn't change for a person. It just changes as people move in and move out of an organization. Then we have feelings and sentiment. This is actually what a bit more kind of broader data. These might be data about how people feel around inclusion, belonging, psychological safety, how they might feel about opportunities at work or transparency of decision making. And a lot of this data is through maybe asking people questions around, you know, through surveys, through listening groups, through conversations that you have. But actually, some of those listening activities will be capturing that information and summarizing that. And AI is also a great tool in terms of summarizing that data that might be more lengthy. Then process life cycle. So you've already started to mention some of this. So this is where we're looking at data across a process. So is it hiring? Is it promotions? If we're talking about supplies, is it the supply procurement process? And the real power with data is when we combine these. So some of the examples that you've shared do that kind of combination of actually maybe we're looking at hiring data through different stages of the hiring process, and we're looking at it according to the demographics of gender. So we might say, I think some of you are familiar with the Gender Equality European and International Standard, the GES reporting. That's combining a couple of these things. Now, I've already started to mention, and you've probably guessed, some of this data is quantitative. So it's, you know, numbers and facts. So like the demographics of data, what you're seeing in your BI dashboard. And then some of it's more qualitative, right? So these surveys, these perceptions, these questions. And again, the power is when we combine both. And I guess the third bit is often we're very focused on internal company data, which is the data we're collecting and reporting on our people. But sometimes we all know it can be challenging to get some of that data. There might be system limitations. So there's also a lot of external data out there. And I encourage you, and we're going to go through some examples to see how can actually data on broader trends help us back up what we're doing, or maybe give us an idea of where there is an opportunity to collect more data internally. Because usually organizations are just a mirror of the societies that we're in and share the same challenges. Okay, so DEI data examples. Now I want to go into some practical examples that I've found freely available on the internet. And after this session, you can have a look. There are links to where this data has come from because it might be really relevant. And I've got a few examples from different parts of the world, but also some global data as well. So if we look at this first one, this is actually data around what we would call quantitative data, looking at various process life cycles by disability as a demographic group across kind of the workplace labor market in America. So this is looking across all those who are working in America, in corporate America. And it's interesting, we can see it's showing that year on year, there is an improvement in terms of how many disabled individuals are actually engaged and participating in work. And that can be quite powerful because it's showing us across different processes, right? Across hiring and job application, we have more. Across promotions, we have more. Across performance management of who's high potential, that they're going up the ranks as well in terms of actually being promoted into management roles. And this external data could be useful as a benchmark, for example. So if we wanted to compare if our company's progress is in line with the overall market in America, or are we slower than the overall market? Because that can be really helpful in terms of seeing, should we be doing better? Are we a follower? Are we a leader? Are we with the pack? And that can be also really helpful when we're talking to leaders, because as we know, leaders have a bit of a competitive streak and no one wants to be behind kind of the general trend. Then I talked about, how do we widen our thoughts around DEI data to get people to think of the commercial, like business imperative? What I love about this, so this is by a big media company called WPP. This was a study in the UK looking at a whole bunch of research at population growth for ethnic groups over the next 40 years or so, and how their spend would increase over that time. So their spend on products and brands. And this kind of research, it's interesting. It's starting to tell a story. If we look at the three kind of things at the top, we can guess here that they've done a survey. So they've gathered some qualitative data of actually how much of the UK population feel that racism is a problem. So we're starting to talk about, right, issues and maybe how engaged people feel in a population if they feel that they're experiencing challenges because of their race. And then also the fact that people think that brands have a really important role to play in culture. So now we're connecting the consumer to the power of brands. And then the last one's the really powerful one. Actually, I can't even imagine what 16 trillion pounds is, but it's showing that ethnic minority groups are one of the fastest growing in terms of disposable income. And so it would be, it's not about just doing the right thing. It would be a complete loss of opportunity, and it would make no business sense if businesses weren't starting to gear up for that. Why would we not cater to a growing customer group? And then how could we really target that and understand that customer group if our employees don't reflect the customers that are out there? So that's also really powerful of how can we use external research to build that kind of business imperative on these things. And then I know also at Inditex, you're looking at generational diversity. Here we can see some interesting things where how can we lean on global studies and research? So Deloitte has done some global listening. So again, there would have been a mass survey sent out to over 20,000 people over 40 countries. And here it's really interesting. We're getting a sense of global trends. And this is where we talk about data correlation. So this research is showing how people's perceptions on the level of opportunities to grow at work, how that links to their happiness and well-being. So actually, if we have an agenda around well-being of our employees, actually, we now understand that between different generational groups, there's a different kind of weighting to how much them feeling they have opportunities to grow at work really inputs and affects well-being. And again, this can tell us things around actually other areas we need to really focus on because we know that one data set is really connected to another. So that sense of correlation is really interesting. And then the last one I'm going to share with you is how do we start to look at, again, the power of qualitative data when it's looked at for a specific demographic group? So Oliver Wyman did this great report in the UAE around women at work. And here we can see, and this is where I've actually used data like this to help with organizations when they're trying to tailor programs around learning and development to really address the specific needs of specific groups. So here we can see very plainly there are certain barriers or lack of opportunities that women are feeling really hold them back. And so this is really giving us a pathway of thinking, actually, how can we really close those gaps for that certain group of people. So now we've talked about those examples. I want to say that those are really kind of data insights and things that we might see more often. Now, if we were to really take this one more level up, this is what we call data storytelling. And what makes a data story is three things. It's data, so the insights that we just saw before. Then it's visuals. So how are we telling a visual story with that data? So there's this term visualization where it's not just about throwing data in a dashboard or on a graph, but how do we make sure that the picture, the visual picture the data is telling us is really compelling and very clear? And then the third element is narrative. Is this data story telling us a clear message? And now we're going to get back into that interactive piece, because I'm going to throw up a few examples and I want you to start sharing in the chat what you think maybe those messages are. So this is a piece of research from McKinsey, and what they've done is they've obviously asked a certain group of women some questions over time. So this is showing trends over time around experience with microaggressions that women are facing on kind of 4 kind of categories. And then you can see a real visual story in terms of the trend over time. Now I'm just going to invite you to the chat. What are the first things that come to you? What is this data story telling you? What looks most interesting? Is something standing out? What do we think the message might be? Please share in the chat. And again, no silly observations, but what's kind of interesting here? Yeah. It's very interesting to see a complete shift in trend, right? So we're seeing one direction over several years, and you'll see here it's it's a 6-year period, and then there's a spike kind of happening across all of these indicators. Yeah, 23 versus 24. Now, this is kind of a general survey. I want you to now think, and feel free also if people want to share, not just in the chat, but want to share their thoughts, feel free to raise your hand on Teams and share verbally through these examples, because I think this is where we really start these. So imagine this is actually about your organization. What might be an action you would take if you saw this data for your own organization? Yeah, what do you think might be the conversations or the actions we might need to take based on that? Because the important thing with data is sometimes we get so obsessed with data, we forget that data is there to drive action, right? It's not to just look pretty at dashboards. So any thoughts? And again, this is just an example, but what if this was Inditex? What might you do in response? And again, feel free to raise your hand if you feel like being bold and sharing your thoughts. Yeah. Push training about this issue according with, yeah, see, looking at the link to the code of conduct. I think there's also about how do we also not just act, but make sure we're digging into the root cause, right? Actually, is part of this root cause that we're not living, our organization's not aligned to values and our code of conduct. How can we root this in other things? Yeah, increase awareness and sensitivity about respect. Yeah, because I think what you're pointing out here is part of this is an inclusion and a gender issue, but part of this is also a bigger issue on respecting our fellow employees. Addressing the trend, explaining what microaggressions are, awareness campaigns. Yep, having an anonymous line to actually keep collecting this is pointing to actually maybe we need to understand more about what those specific instances are. So it could be an anonymous line. You might even decide to do listening groups to actually start to understand the depth examples, the anecdotes, so we can really focus effort, digging into the real problem, solve it from the roots. Exactly. Awareness first, how to recognize these issues. So I think, these trends, it's then actually understanding, right, what are the things that we need to act on? And we might have a good gut sense of what that action is, but also where do we need to dig a little bit deeper so that we know actually what exactly is driving this? Sometimes it could be, do we want to look at this data by department? Right? Maybe there's a specific part of the business where it's particularly bad, because we know often it's a handful of leaders, like leadership sets the tone. Transparency of results. Okay, I'm keeping, anonymous email, a committee to investigate. Yeah, you might have a task force that's trying to understand this. What triggered the increase? Yes, again, a lot of this goes well beyond, DEI. So you might have to start connecting with people in other parts of your organization that look at anti-harassment policy. And also, do we need to look at, is our unconscious bias efforts, is it not quite hitting the mark? So again, and you're getting all of this from a one-page visual, right? So if you look at this data story, there's a lot of data points that are sitting behind this, but it has illustrated a very clear, you don't feel overwhelmed, right? It's very clear what the message is that we're trying to take away from this. Okay, another example, and with all of these examples, I'm going to ask you to keep thinking as you are. So this is a data visualization. So if you're really into data and just feel like getting into it, this source at the bottom, Information is Beautiful, is a really great site. There's a lot of cool, fun, dynamic visualizations, but there aren't that many on diversity, equity, inclusion. Now, I want you to just gut feel. I'm not going to tell you too much about this, other than this is an example of visualizing, showing the biggest difference and gaps between groups. Right here, the groupings are men and women, and the groupings are the type of job that they have, those categories that are running down vertically. So what is most interesting, or what is standing out from this data story? Yep, there's a real gap. Are your eyes drawn to like a specific part of this image? Yeah, so I mean, it's pretty, I know it's kind of tiny, but this long one here, there are two that really stand out in terms of the size of the gap when we're talking about doctors and surgeons, one, and maybe a bit shockingly for us, because I'm sure you deal with your HR folks a bit, with HR managers, right? Because the global trend tends to be there's a lot of women in HR, but interesting how the workforce percentage doesn't always impact kind of the level of leadership or salary, right? That's really interesting. So here, this is where it can be super, super compelling in terms of when we start to drill into granularity, right? So the magic of data storytelling is trying to figure out, actually, if we dig a certain level down, does something really interesting emerge, right? And here we've started to dig into job categories. Depending on how you talk about it, might be job families or inditex. Do you know what I mean? Then we start to see something really, really interesting. And also, it's just super obvious, right? Now we feel like, actually, we need to find out why. We need to understand, probably dig more into that data and understand what those systemic barriers are. Yeah, perfect. Last one I want to share. So this is actually looking across the world. This is a public study that's just generally looking at a government set out paid leave and whether there's paid leave available for mothers and infants. So, a version of this could be you doing it for an organization, your organization, and looking at your own parental leave policy and how it varies across different parts of your business. So again, same question. What is this data story telling you? What's kind of jumping out? And this is an example of how we're visualizing differences across many data sets, right? So many different countries and regions. So have a think. What is this data story telling you? What's interesting? Or what looks like a real problem? There's a bit of a north versus south difference. US doesn't look great. Yeah. And yeah, the majority of the world is not giving enough leave as a whole. Yeah. So then what does that mean in terms of the proportion of caregiving that naturally falls to women anyway? How supported do they really feel? Only 20. Yeah. And I also found it interesting how sometimes there's a pattern in like a region, because obviously the data is each country has a color, a red, amber, green rating. But it's like actually it's interesting that to see who is the outlier in an area where actually it looks generally green, but there's red, or it's generally orange and there's a red. I'd love to hear from you now of if this was your organization. So I've actually seen versions of this like I think it might have been Accenture where for a period of time they were tracking kind of the percentage of countries that had equal parental leave across genders, for example. So if this was actually an image of what paid leave was available at Inditex by country, and let's imagine Inditex is in all of these countries, what might be an action that you would take if you saw this data? Or what might be something you'd want to find out more about? And this is, a little less obvious than the first example, but what are some of the things we might want to dig into? What are some of the actions or things we might want to investigate? Yeah. And yeah, this is what you're starting to raise. And uh, Advaita, yes, this might be a bit of a older piece of data. So thanks for pointing that out. You know what you're all kind of saying here, which is, have we started to talk about bigger questions of um, what does good look like for us as an organization? Who do we want to be as Inditex? Because actually different organizations will have a different appetite. So I started in audit and risk. We have this concept of risk appetite, but actually this appetite applies to anything, right? What is at Chanel, we talked about position. They love to say the word position. It was like, what is our position on this? So actually, data like this could drive really strategic conversations with leaders to say, actually, who do we want to be? What are we aiming for? Do we want to be one of those organizations that says we have a global standard and this is our approach, irrespective of what happens in local areas? Is our hope that actually, let's say, I think someone said it looks like only 20% of countries look like they have a good kind of maternity leave policy. Maybe it's that we want to first shift to 40%. Right? And then see, and maybe we recognize there's a handful of countries that are going to be harder than others. So we want to pick the ones that we can really make that change swiftly. Data like this could really drive, and what you're talking about is not a small thing. This is a big kind of position. This is looking at employee law. This is looking at HR and benefits, and this is kind of cross-organizational change, but super powerful. And actually, there are organizations that have come out and said this. So Accenture had a tracking thing, I remember, where they said, oh, so far 90% of the countries we operate in, we've achieved good paid parental leave, and we're aiming for 100% by 2030. It was something like that. Okay, so we've exercised our brain a little bit with data, and I guess hopefully what I'm trying to share with you here is there are a few things that you've already started to put into practice in terms of how we look at data. How can we potentially use data in this more advanced data storytelling way? And also, how do we question data? Because we can't always take it at face value. So now, before we go into questions and answers, so please start thinking of any questions, answers, or thoughts you want to share. I want us to maybe share in the chat or come off mute and raise your hand if you feel like it. I'm going to sum up with us going through what makes a data story effective. I want you to think about from the examples we saw, what made those data stories convincing or compelling? Like, what made them really effective? What made them get the key message across? And if you feel like some of them could have done things better, I'm interested to hear in that too. But yeah, what do you think made those data stories effective, that we were able to drive so much conversation and thought based on just one image on a page? And then I'll share some top tips. Yeah, having the power is like having a lot of data that you're sharing, but it feels like it's not a lot of data, right? That's kind of part of the power, the visual part of it as well. Yeah, color coding, yes, summarizing with visuals. Also this kind of qualitative piece. Yeah, you're right. I guess the last example was more quantitative, but here we're like telling this story, there's a narrative. Yeah, is it easy to visualize and is it easy to digest, right? Because sometimes data can just feel like you're not sure which part you're meant to really be drawn into. I love this, the emotional impact of data storytelling. I don't know if you felt this, but some of it felt like, oh, we really need to do something. There was like a sense of urgency, like there's a real problem here and I can see it now. Yeah, there's real insights and avoiding assumptions, and I think it really does give you an idea of it's linking things to strategy and policy. That's right. These things were speaking to bigger things. It made us think of like the values. It made us think of what policies are breaking down that have led to this data story. Not too much data, yes. Yeah, using accurate data is really important as well. Yeah, and there's a bit of like a journey, isn't there? How to transform data into, perfectly said. We talk in the data world about data is raw facts. Insights is when you put context around it. And then that data story is when there's true meaning and it's kind of compelling people to act. Great. Thank you so much. So I'm now just going to run through some top tips and then we're going to have some time for questions and answers. And you've answered a lot of this, but I want you to have these top tips to refer to and share with others. So how do we look at data? Well, you've already practiced some of this. Look for correlations. What data patterns seem related? Because actually that can be really, really powerful. Identify trends or turning points in a trend. We saw that in the examples. Look for comparisons between data sets. Look for outliers and ask why. So that global map at the end, where there's maybe just one red country in a region that it isn't also having the same issue, that's really important to dig into. And pay attention to like unexpected data, like those microaggressions. We had a trend and then an unexpected change happened. Do we need to dig into what was going on around that time? How do we question data? I think someone already brought this up. We should be asking the question whenever we see data, can I rely on it? Can I trust this data? Are there any limits or issues? So for example, if we do a survey and we share results, maybe one of the limits we want to share is that only 30 people responded. So this isn't necessarily representing a big chunk of people, but it still has some insight to share. Is there a clear message, takeaway, or call to action? I think some of the examples we saw, that was really strong. Has the data changed over time? Are we comparing like for like? So, sometimes when we have, we might be reporting something on a dashboard, but have we actually been asking the same questions year on year on year, or has the question slightly changed? Because then maybe we're not comparing like for like. What's most interesting about the data? Do we need to dig further? I feel like that came up quite a bit, but we don't always ask that second bit, do we need to dig further? So the data might give us enough to act on, but we might need to dig further to get to that root cause. And is there any context you need to know to interpret the data correctly? So maybe there's some trends we're looking at, and actually maybe there was a huge restructure in your organization at a certain time, and straight after that we sent out an engagement survey. We might want to share that context because that will have an impact. And finally, how do we present data? This is what you were answering when I asked what makes a data story effective. The narrative, the takeaway, the message should really stand out. And I'll be honest, most of the time when we present data, this is the piece that is missing. Cater to the audience, because different people want to know different levels of detail, and avoid communicating too much data. If we visualize things, we can get a lot of data across, but make sure those visuals are clear and we're drawing focus to the most important data points. There's also things you can check, and you can use AI and tech to help with you. Is it visually accessible? So actually, if people have visual impairments, use of color and contrast really important. And let's make sure we know if we can rely on the data before we use it. Okay, so I've shared a lot with you now, and I wanted to kind of hand the mic to you to ask any questions. While you're thinking of those questions, I just want to share a bit more about me and what I do. So let me just get back into presentation mode. And please do put your questions in the chat, and feel free to ask me anything. I'm someone who is very open, and I want you to feel super comfortable doing that. So please do share in the chat. In the meantime, just so you're aware, please do connect with me if you like. I love a random connection. If a question comes up after this session, I'm really open to answering that. And I know you're all doing lots of work in your own areas. So hopefully it comes across. I'm super passionate about this work. We know diversity, equity, inclusion relies on changing culture and mindsets and empowering people, and embedding inclusion. So, I'm just going to leave this up here. This is kind of the other stuff I do, but I can see we have a question already. Yes, what is your opinion about a unique policy in different companies with regard to parental leave? So I think with this, and I'll come out of the sharing. Yeah, so, the one thing I will talk about, which maybe doesn't directly answer this, but again, Nacho, if you have a view, feel free to jump in. I think organizations are now making it clear whether they operate what's called an embassy model, which is when you walk into the virtual or physical walls of our office or our business or our store, irrespective of what's happening in the local context, there are some certain baseline policies, because we have certain values and we have certain minimum standards that we're going to stick with. And I've noticed that very much is something that's used to say that actually, how do we reduce the amount of differences between countries and not have to react all the time when politics in a local area changes things? But in terms of, different countries regarding parental leave, I think there is obviously a lot more work to do where certain countries are better on shared parental leave and also parental leave and not just maternity leave. This shift of how do we make sure that someone from any gender should feel as empowered to take that leave. But I think this embassy model is like really important. Nacho, I don't know if you had thoughts on that.
Yes, no, you explained it perfectly. I think that parental leave can give us for another hour because it's such a big topic. But I think you touched two important points here. So one of it is how we can make sure that parental leave is parental leave and not only maternity leave. I think that's great. And I think that the company is doing a great effort on that. And also, as you said, that how we can improve that in countries that have really like legislations that are really very lax, very, 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 let's say, low in that sense. And I can give you a quick example is the US. We saw in the map that the only one having it was a couple of countries, but one of them it was the US that had no parental leave, let's say from a federal perspective. And companies, including Inditex, of course, we've been working a lot in the last years. For instance, right now in the US, we have 16 weeks. That is much more than many companies, and there are companies that have even 0 weeks of parental leave or paid leave, let's say. And on top of that, in the US as well is parental leave and not only maternity leave. So step by step, countries and companies are getting better with this, thankfully, because parental leave is so important to promote family and to support kids and families. So yeah, it's something that is very relevant. But that being said, to the particular questions you are asking, Pier Alessandro, I think it's complicated to have a global one because of the differences. I think it is a topic that is so different between the countries that are more advanced with the countries that are really less advanced. Okay.
Yeah, definitely. A question on data and AI. So I think what's really interesting here is we should be asking these questions whether we're collecting data manually through a system or through AI technology, and that is what data is missing. So I think that the element with AI is there can be bias that's built into how we're collecting data. There's a great book called Invisible Women, if you're interested in it, about how a lot of data sets are default male and women aren't even included in that data. So it's a big conversation, but what I would say is we should always question the quality of data no matter the source. It's just that AI is like more of a souped up version where maybe we're looking at a lot more data in a shorter period of time. But this is what we call data governance. We should always be questioning, when we're looking at this data, how complete is it? Is it like we're looking at 60% of the population, 30%, 100%, like how many people have disclosed? Are there any issues in terms of reliability? Do we know there's certain data missing? So I think it's just we need to be really vigilant with those questions. I know we have one hand up and then we'll wrap up. Hello, what was your question?
Hi, actually, it's not a question, but I wanted to hear your take on this.
Okay.
I have like my own opinion that sometimes the data and reports are a little bit too far-fetched. So I will give you an example. I've been on a meeting with Open for Business Forum that they have presented a report with the data that the companies that implement D&I strategies, they have higher revenue. And as they said during the meeting, this is the data that helps you to convince your board in your company in order to like have the strategy for the D&I in your company. But at the end, for me, as an economist, this data is far-fetched since usually the companies that implement D&I strategies are bigger companies. So not like local national small companies, but big companies like, I don't know, Inditex, IKEA, Chanel, Microsoft, and Google. So at the end, it's very understandable that they have a higher revenue. And I think that sometimes having bad conclusions within our data or having done good for the cause and for at the end, like it's not about convincing the board, it's about showing the reality of the business and reality of the market. So I wanted to hear what your take on it.
Yeah, so I think there's kind of two things. There's no one data point or study that's going to convince someone. It is a holistic piece. I think where we can get really targeted, so that consumer report I mentioned that WPP shared, it's kind of a very obvious story that actually our customers in any market are actually changing, and why, that we can say things. So I think I'm not against those studies that show that revenue increases where you have more diversity, but we need to paint a bit of a picture, right? So what drives your organization? I have seen there is so much data that shows that innovation is increased when you have diversity, because it's the ideas that come through. It's also you feel comfortable to throw in that wacky idea, which is the idea that you need because everyone's not agreeing with each other. If innovation is a driver for your organization, that should be part of your story, and there is data to back that up. If your organization is large and has a huge revenue footprint, those McKinsey studies that talk about gender diversity and revenue might be helpful in that story. But also, if you're a brand that is trying to grow your brand and not leave customers out, looking at data which is really obvious that the growing populations around the world are actually populations that have often been forgotten by brands, that is a really kind of, and this is based on population growth, right? There's no magic science about this. This is projected population growth, spend growth. I think how do we create various touch points so that we're not using like one story to win people over, I think is really important. But I think there's two things that are underused. The fact that no business would want to leave a customer segment out, and we are leaving them out, right? And this is just obvious stuff. And again, this innovation piece, because business is so hard now, economies are volatile, it's all about being innovative, right? And there is so much around, there's a book I would recommend called Rebel Ideas by Matthew Said. There is so much compelling evidence that just how we problem solve and how we innovate is so reliant on diversity, equity, inclusion. And we live in such a tough business world now that you need to innovate to survive. You need to problem solve to survive. And so I think maybe to your point, it's not just, we'll make heaps of money if we do this. It's like, actually, these are tied to some really solid business drivers that align to our growth strategy. So I think we just need to be maybe a bit more nuanced and read the room. Which of these studies and which of these arguments are going to really resonate with the leaders who are in charge and the gatekeepers that have the most influence. But I know we've gone over time. There has been a feedback survey that has been shared in the chat. So please do that. But as I said, there's so much to cover in this. I apologize, we've gone a bit over, but you will have the slides. Take the time to look into like some of the examples in the links that are in the slides and have some follow-on conversations, because these are skills that it's not even about DEI. In your day job, being more confident with data is going to help you so much. So how can you start to maybe use the things we've practiced today, even in your day job? And yeah, connect with me if you like. Thank you, Nacho, for having me and the We Are Overview team.
Thank you so much, Sathya. Thank you. And thanks everyone for attending. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Have a nice day, everyone.